3 more additions to the Threadripper Pro family. MSI, Dell, and ASRock. MSI finally has a page up on their WS WRX80 Workstation Motherboard. A few specs, but not enough specs. But there are a couple of items in the specifications and in the data sheet that we can go through that I think will be most interesting. And Dell has given us information on the Precision 7865 Tower, and apparently they're revamping that product line to also include now the Threadripper Pro. Some of the specs listed will give you some idea of what you can expect on the new Precision 7865 Tower Threadripper Pro. More ETA, who knows? We'll just have to wait and watch and listen. But the most exciting part has to be what ASRock is doing with their WRX80 Creator. And this is the one we have the most details on, probably of any of the motherboards right now that talk to us not only about the 3000 series processor, but also about the 5000 series processor. Now, there's 2 things about this board that I like. There's a couple of things I'm not real fond of. I want to get into that and go through some of the specs. So we're going to look at the description, we're going to look at the specifications, then we're going to go through the manual and show you some things, because a key feature that stands out on this motherboard that we're going to have in the title is this is Thunderbolt 4. And that means we can now have Thunderbolt 4 on the WRX80 Threadripper Pro. Beforehand, you could only have Thunderbolt 3, and that was with a Gigabyte board. And that was one of the big reasons for the Gigabyte TRX40 designaires, because we have Thunderbolt 3 right here as an add-in card. Now, historically, Thunderbolt has always been either an add-in card or it's built onto the motherboard. But with what we're seeing now on this new motherboard from ASRock, and remember, the first one was about the ASRock rack, which is still a preliminary spec. All this information is going to be in the description. And what's also significant about this motherboard as we go through these specs, this is available on Newegg right now for sale. That's pretty exciting. And this, of course, is the ASRock rack. I just want to give this for reference. Still says preliminary. One significant item that I won't get down too far into the weeds about was in the specs. This had Thunderbolt 3, to reiterate, listed. That has now been removed. Maybe it'll get put back. I don't know. But still not available, still preliminary, but we still keep checking. And this motherboard, as listed on Newegg, shows a price which, considering what you have here, is pretty favorable with a number of slots. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And as we look at these 7 slots, I'm going to go into the manual. 5 16-lane slots and 2 8-lane slots. I'll get more into that in just a minute. But what I really want to focus on, let's start at the beginning and go through the specs, because this is the first motherboard we've seen where we can see some significant specs that deal with the 3000 series and the 5000 series that also talk about the BIOS versions. This board, as it ships out of the gate, is going to have the BIOS that'll work with both series of chips. It's just a matter of time. So if you can get your hands on the motherboard and you want Thunderbolt 4, there it is. The CPU, we're expecting about October. So even though we're talking about 3 particular items, this one item is the biggest thing we've seen yet. Who else is going to join this bandwagon? Who knows? We're just going to have to keep watching. Wouldn't it be wild if EGA decided to make one of these motherboards? Who knows? I'm just throwing that out there. Let's go back to these specs. Now, starting with the description on this board, one item that I'm excited about, again to reiterate, is Thunderbolt 4. An item that I am not excited about is Nahimic audio. We had an experience, and I want to just put this in as a side note real quick. We had an experience, to reiterate, with a motherboard MSI that had Nahimic audio. And we were using that particular system as a workstation to edit video. And because we edit audio in that, we had Nahimic audio, and we had a problem we couldn't nail down. Every time we'd get to it, try to fix it, the bug would move somewhere else. Come to find out, it was Nahimic. So my name for that is anemic audio. So if you're going to use that, which is what we're talking about for a purpose-built machine, this is about video editing, but you're also going to be doing audio editing. Then my suggestion, based on that prior experience, which was about 2 generations back, so we're putting that at about 5 years back, I would be very leery of installing Nahimic audio. That's one detractor. Another oddity is the way the slot assignments are arranged. I'll get into that in a minute. But the biggest detractor is Nahimic, but it's not a deal killer. I just want to mention it. So to reiterate, you're probably going to be using a pro audio interface. That will get turned off anyway. But if you're going to try to use the motherboard audio, think twice about using that, because of the experience that I had. It was PITA. But the configuration for Thunderbolt 4 on this board to reiterate, as I've said before, we'll get a better understanding of that once we get to the manual, because remember, Thunderbolt has always been an add-in card or built onto the board. This is different. This is really different. And everything about Thunderbolt 4 has been vendor specific, and that is specifically as Thunderbolt deals with not just the add-in card that plugs into the motherboard, but how you handle that, like that cable which we have here, which goes from the Thunderbolt card to a header on the motherboard, and that enables BIOS support. And BIOS support is required to make everything down the line stand up. It's all part of the game. And the way this is enabled on this board, that cable doesn't exist. It's part of the connector. But we'll get more into it. I just want to give you a heads up about it, because this is wild. Very different than anything we've seen. And of course we have dual 10 gigabit LAN, which is exciting. Wi-Fi I'm not so excited about. If you've ever had an issue with DPC latency, that would probably be the first thing to turn off. And on a workstation with 10 gigabit Ethernet, I want a hardwired connection. I don't want Wi-Fi, but it's plugged in. It can be removed. The problem is getting the cowling off to remove it. Maybe easier just to turn it off. But that is using up one PCI Express lane. Yes, we have lots of PCI Express lanes, but I just want to mention it. I'm going to bring up the I/O panel so you can take a look at that right quick. This may be easier for us to examine from Newegg because of the image on the left where I'm zoomed in, where you can see on the right side, you see 4 connections, 2 USB-C connections, which are Thunderbolt, and then you have your 2 mini display port, which are typically on most motherboards display port, but to reiterate, these are mini display port. So Thunderbolt does 3 things: power delivery, we'll get to that, data connectivity, which is the one I'm a fan of, whether it be for just straight data or whether it could be for a Thunderbolt audio interface, one of those two. And then of course the third thing is if you want to route video. So out of your GPU into one of the mini display port connectors and then back out through Thunderbolt. If you're using an RTX Pro Series card, I want that to go straight to the monitor because the GPU is all about rendering. And for a purpose-built computer, which CPUs and which GPU we use would be dependent, I would say, based on the Adobe After Effects multi-frame rendering CPU optimization formula. That's what we build toward. Now, for anybody else that's building to anything else, what you build toward would be based on the rendering engine that you use, but that is still my reference because it is a purpose-built and a balanced-built computer. And for that machine, so for that spec, number 1, CPU cores times 4 equals RAM. Number 2, CPU core count equals video RAM. So that'll give you something to think about. But I wanted to point this out because this is in the middle of the I/O panel, and that is not hardwired to the motherboard. Another thing I want to point out that you can take a look at here on the right, where it looks like the I/O panel itself is a little off center with the ports. The reason for that, and that's one of the features that ASRock points out, is it's adjustable. How much adjustable, I don't know, but enough that you can get everything centered, which I haven't had a problem with that on some machines, which brings up another issue about a case, which will be another video, because I think I found a case that I would like for this motherboard. I looked at one from Supermicro, which looks great, but it's huge. I looked at one from Gigabyte, same thing. It's great, but it's huge. I found another one, separate video, that I would point out that gives me the drive bays on the front because, well, once we get to the specs, we got lots of SATA ports that I'd like to have access to. Now, this will support if you're going to overclock, and the overclock, of course, would occur if you're doing one of the 5000 series processors up to DDR4 4533 plus. But to do that, there's a list of RAM, and even though we're not there, because I'm showing you this as we go through this spec, as we reference things back and forth, there's going to be some redundancy because the RAM is very specific. So as always, 2 things to think about. Do you want to use ECC RAM, DDR4 3200? If you're going to do overclock, which means you're going to use a 5000 series processor, which we're all waiting on, then you're going to be very specific about not only the brand of RAM you use, but also the density of RAM you use. So if you say, well, I want to go to 512 gigs of RAM, no motherboard I've seen yet with the WRX80 has tested anything beyond 32 gig sticks, which means 256 gigs of RAM. So if you can live with the density of RAM they're showing for the speed, then you'll get the speed, but you're going to have to choose. Even the Samsung B-Die stuff, there is a limit on what has been tested. There's also a limit on what's available, just like the ECC. But again, to reiterate, I would stick with whatever is on the hardware compatibility list. I think that's important. That will ensure your success to get that thing up and running, so you can get that thing up and working, so you can get that thing up to paying for itself. Rendering. And it talks about the 7 PCI Express 4.0 by 16 slots mechanically, but not electrically. We have 8 SATA ports, a primary M.2 and a secondary M.2. We'll get to where those are located and what kind of resource allocation they have. This also has U.2 on it, if you choose to use that, based on the configuration. Before we get to the manual, let's look at specifications. And another feature that stands out, which may not show right here. No, it does not. We're going to have to do another video on this particular information that I'm getting ready to share with you. Right now, what this shows is USB-C 10 gigabit. There is a USB-C 20 gigabit port on this motherboard. It talks about it in the description. It doesn't show it on the information with Newegg, but it's in the description, and once we look at the PDF manual, it'll show up there as well. And of course, not all motherboards have that, but it's on this one. We'll come back to it. Support for the Threadripper Pro 5000 and 3000 series processor, and that's with the motherboard shipping out of the box. And of course, 8-channel DDR4, ECC and non-ECC, to reiterate that. We'll get into the specs on that in just a minute. Supports DDR4 3200 natively. Affirmative on that. The ACPI compliance on wake-up events. This is something else we need to interject, because I had a comment about the Asus WRX80. Someone was really upset with the way the machine wouldn't wake up for a client. Okay, these are workstations. These are not desktop computers. So these need to be in a high performance profile. So under the settings, under the advanced power management, if you have a setting there that you can turn that thing on to stay on all the time in the BIOS, do so, because this is not one of those and one of the ports that deals with USB for power delivery we'll get to, that talks about doesn't support wake up on LAN, or excuse me, doesn't support wake up on that port with a power delivery port, which makes sense because it's got to stay on to be on. So to reiterate, set your power profile to high performance, always on. It's either always on or always off. There's no in between. This is a workstation. If you need to reboot it to reset, then reboot. But if it works, it works. Power profiles for low performance computers, this is a high performance computer. And of course the AS speed. Now, even though there's a lot of things on this motherboard that we could get into, we may or may not. And the reason I say that, and I'm again to preface that, this is a workstation, so we're going to treat it as one workstation, not multiple workstations. So some of those features in a multi-work environment that would come in really handy and crucial, we will address as questions arise to address those issues. Right now, we just want to see what it's going to take to make this thing work. And I am stoked about this motherboard because we've had a lot of people looking for Thunderbolt 4. We didn't have a solution, now we do. On the WRX80. It has a Realtek chipset for the audio, which will be fine. Just think twice about the Nahimic driver, unless that's been improved. But I don't have time to go around chasing ghosts in audio. The 10 gigabit LAN, I believe when we look in the manual, it will tell us the chipset. Okay, here we are on the slot layout that we'll verify in the manual. For the PCI Express with 16 slots mechanically, electrically, 1, 2, 3, 5, and 7. Which means, as we look over here, 4 and 6 are by 8. And that's something we need to be aware of. Kind of odd. That's one of those things I'm not wild about. If I'd had a choice and they'd asked me how to do that, I'd rather had one less slot so I could have had one more slot for a 16-lane slot where I could put a quad card in like I can on this. But hey, in this machine, I've only got 2 16-lane slots and 2 8-lane slots. All 4 are 16-lane slots mechanically, but only 2 are 16-lane slots electrically. Electrically, the other 2 16-lane slots are 8-lane slots, to reiterate. So with that motherboard, I got plenty of resources where I can put in the GPU I need to match my CPU and my RAM. Maybe 2 if I go that route, but I'm going to try to stay away from it. But I'll be able to put in, if I want, 4 quad cards. Pretty wicked stuff. I've got an idea in mind for a video that's going to take 2 quad cards. 2 quad cards each with 8 drives. I know, some pretty wicked stuff, but you know, got to see down the road to see what we're building here, so what we do here affects out yonder. Building a system, first of all, a computer is based on the motherboard. Motherboard's your foundation. So you've got RAM, motherboard, and processor. The foundation of the motherboard is the chipset. So we advanced and talked about the TRX40. But the WRX80, for all the things you guys want to do, based on adding storage down the road, this is where you need to be. Because in the next video, we're going to be talking about a lower end chipset where somebody wants to add a quad card, and we're going to go through and explain the what, why, and how of what makes that work. What we like about it, the pros and the cons, what's wrong with it. And the low-end chipsets do not have enough resources. That's all it amounts to, is mostly PCI Express resources is what we focus on. But the other advantages we gain with a workstation is heavy lifting power, muscle. And having these slots like this, let's take a look as we get into the manual. And it'll support NVMe disks as boot. That's another piece of technology we need to talk about. Microsoft is encouraging vendors, of which there I believe are now 3 on board, to no longer use a hard drive, which would be a SATA hard drive, as a boot drive. Well, that should have been done a long time ago anyway because they're so slow, but we still use them for storage. Okay, I'll get a link up to that particular article, but there's another article that talks about 3 vendors, Lenovo being one of them. You're going to hear that name a couple more times. For example, Lenovo is going to be the exclusive distributor when the MSI WRX80 motherboard first comes out. One article said for about 30 days. Lenovo is also one of the vendors on board with Microsoft about no longer shipping lower end computers with just a SATA hard drive. They're going to be using SSDs, which should have been done a long time ago, but they're still going to be SSDs. Now the question is, will they be a straight SATA SSD or will it be an M.2 SATA SSD? Don't know, because everything that we're talking about that we do is with an M.2 NVMe PCI Express SSD. And once you've gone that route, you don't ever want to go back. But I wanted to point it out since it was here in these specs because it's a big deal going forward. It's one of those little things you're going to see just drop off. If nobody talks about it, we have. Okay, now here's where we get into the way resources are allocated. On the CPU, an M.2_1, and through the chipset, M.2_2. And then, of course, through the chipset, 8 SATA ports and 1 U.2 connector. And this says this will also support the ASRock U.2 kit. If that's the kit that I think it is, that I'm aware of, it allows you to convert an M.2 to a U.2, if that's something you want to do. But I'm not a fan of U.2. That was a big deal at one time. I prefer the M.2 form factor. And on a side note again, M.2s are probably going to stay at about 8 terabytes. The technology exists and they've overcome some of the limitations for 16 terabyte. We're going to be seeing that soon. Sabrent will probably be the first. There's been some issues with the chipset from Phison. I think they got worked out. But the problem I see is they're not going forward with the technology because of the capacity and the speed, but they're going back with some of the technology, again, because of the speed, which means that 16 terabyte drive is not going to be so fast. So 8 terabyte is going to be the performance that we're going to be looking at. And if you want to put 4 of those on a quad card, you can do the math. 2 quad cards, that's some wicked storage if you need it. But I wanted to mention the U.2 because somebody will ask. Now this is what I find curious. This talks about on the SATA we can get RAID 0, 1, 5, and 10. But on the M.2 it says RAID can only be 0, 1, or 5. I'm kind of surprised that says that. So, take some of this with a grain of salt. As we have reiterated before, whenever you see documentation that says one thing, what matters is always test and verify, and whatever you see in the BIOS, that is what counts. And if there's a discrepancy, the BIOS wins. So I would expect to see, to reiterate, in the BIOS that the NVMe could be RAID 10 if you choose that. However, everybody always wants RAID, what I call by the seat of the pants, which is RAID 0, the fastest. And when it gets time to do that video, we'll get to that. The first thing will be to build the machine and get it up and running, get past what I call the smoke test. And things may look kind of squirrely because we're dealing with a smoke test. It's about let's plug it in, get it up, make it work. Once we've got past the smoke test, then we'll go down to make everything pretty and tie everything down. Because if you've ever been in a smoke test and something doesn't work and you got to start pulling stuff out, I don't want to start having to pull cables out. That just increases your downtime and more stuff you're having to deal with than necessary. But I pointed out, and why not? Because if I don't, somebody else will. This also has the TPM header for those that want to run Windows 11, and there are driver support for Windows 10 and Windows 11. And there's also a COM port header, a system management bus header for the power supply, nice, and a BMC system management bus header. And the reason I'm pointing these out, there is no header on here, shows the fan connections and the power connections, but it does not indicate a header that I'm aware of for Thunderbolt. Points out a USB 2 header, supports 2 USB ports, ESD protection, nice. 2 USB 3.2 Generation 1 headers for 4 USB 3.2 ports, which will be 10 gigabit. A front panel USB-C, and it says 3.2 Generation 2. I believe the front panel, according to another place that I'll show you in a second, points that out as a 20 gigabit USB-C header, which would be defined as a 2x2 header for 20 gigabit. It's kind of ironic here we're talking about USB that we're going to do a video on for 5 gigabit, 10 gigabit, and 20 gigabit, and we're looking at 40 gigabit with Thunderbolt 4, which is for the bi-directional. But you have to remember that Thunderbolt 3 and Thunderbolt 4 is based on PCI Express 3. So yes, it works with PCI Express 4, but the bandwidth is PCI Express 3. Why am I prefacing this? Because USB 4 is just right there at us, waiting on chipsets to get approved, and we're going to be seeing USB 4 in a big way. So all these little things need to be pointed out, because somebody will always ask the question, as we're here talking about over there, what do you see going down the road? And these are the things I'm trying to share with you as we talk about now what's coming down the road. PCI Express 4, PCI Express 5, it's a whole new game. New motherboards, new chipsets. Right now, we're WRX80, we're at a 5000 series processor, and that's what we're waiting on. That's what we want to build. And we're going to have Thunderbolt 4, and we can have USB-C 20 gigabit or 20 gigabit USB-C, which is generally listed 2x2. But I want to point this out as we come to it. There is one mention here of about the power supply. We recommend using a power supply with a maximum current of 3 amps on the plus 5 volt SB side. And there's the Thunderbolt 40 gigabit. Thunderbolt has ESD protection, which is extremely important for electrostatic discharge. But I'm surprised this spec doesn't show the 20 gigabit port. I'll find another spot or two where it does. So there's some discrepancy. I'm sure they'll clean that up eventually. This also makes note of mentioning when you're going to hook up the display port that you got to use a mini display port to display port adapter cable, and to use the straight cables, not use right angle cables. And here's the issue about power delivery, and that would affect also your power plan. Ultra USB power is supported on USB 3.1/1/2 ports. ACPI wake-up function is not supported on those ports, which stands to reason to reiterate. If you're going to have power in that port's got to stay alive. Otherwise, the machine shuts down, power shuts down. So there's no wake-up on ACPI for that particular port. That's why. But again, high performance. This is not your average desktop. The ASRock motherboard utility, I'm a little concerned about. I don't like extemporaneous software. Again, this is a workstation, so I've had okay luck with ASRock software in the past. I've had good luck with ASUS software in the past. I've had terrible luck with Gigabyte software in the past. So I hope ASRock is doing better with this now, but that is something I want to mention that I will be leery of installing. But if you do and you have issues, be prepared. And that's one of the things when building a system, is to get it built, go through the installs, get everything set up and running, and leave as much extemporaneous software off as possible. Because if you start loading all that stuff in and you're going down the path of discovery while you're working with a new platform, as we've done with this computer, the TRX40, because it was new, we were very methodical in our approach to everything we did systematically so that we could verify each phase and each step. So that way, if we had something pop up as a gotcha, we had some indication of where to go without having to start all over. And that's one of the reasons I mentioned about this software. Think twice. Don't install that in the beginning. Think twice about doing that until you get the machine built and make sure it's stable. So then if you have a stability issue, give it a little time. That would be one place to me that would be circumspect. But if you, again, reiterate, install it in the beginning, you have no idea where the problem is, then you got to break it down and start figuring out hardware, software, user, who's on first. Something to think about. And as we're building these new platforms with these new motherboards, we have to think about that. The accessories, there's going to be a driver CD, 4 SATA cables, even though we have 8 SATA ports, screws for the M.2 sockets, and standoffs for the M.2 sockets. And of course, the first thing we're going to want to do, get the motherboard, do an unboxing, and then go through and do an inventory. Anything that would be a deal breaker. Stuff for the Wi-Fi is not a deal breaker, but I hope it's there. Stuff for SATA cables is not a deal breaker, but I hope it's there. Even the M.2 screws is a bit of a problem, but not a deal breaker. But we need to be aware of those kind of things and look for all that stuff, because if anything's missing, the first thing they're going to say is, they won't send you the parts. They'll tell you to RMA and send the motherboard back, start the process over. So do that. Check for all that stuff before you start building and then start figuring out something's missing. It's a coulda, shoulda, woulda moment. Plenty of connectors on the board for monitoring and managing heat. Here's another favorite I wanted to point out. Instead of an XL ATX, this time we're dealing with an EATX. So it should be a little easier finding a case, of which, as to reiterate, I have found one that I really like. It gives me access to all the front drive bays, so I can get access to all those drives, which for me is a long-term case, which makes it mean it will work for more than one machine. And it's different than all the cases we looked at, but separate video. But I need to mention it because that's a big deal. EATX, which is bigger than ATX, and Windows 10, Windows 11. I'm going to go back over here to Overview on this motherboard, and I'm going to do a search on the page for 2x2, and there it is. It's listed in the description and also another place in the manual. And it's on the front USB 3.2 generation 2x2 Type C, and that will get us 20 gigabit. And there's a picture of the connector. So as one of the items we're going to be looking at on that case, to have access to front drive bays, nothing from the side so we can keep the lids on, but also do we have a USB-C port on the front so we can have access to that 20 gigabit port. I'd like to have that access, and that's been slow coming out on cases for quite some time. And there's a nice little drawing that shows us we go from USB 5 gigabit, 10 gigabit, and then 20 gigabit. And if we look over here at the I/O panel, these two ports on Newegg on the left show USB, and these two show USB 3.2. So my expectation, I think these are USB 3, but I expect these will probably be 5 gigabit ports. My expectation that these two will be 10 gigabit ports, and my expectation that these two will also be 10 gigabit ports. But as anything that we point out, again, we need to check all the ports. That's part of the smoke test once the system's up, is to go through and check all that stuff and test and verify and see what kind of throughput we've got. That's going to be the proof, because we have seen discrepancies, and we're pointing some of those out now. And then, of course, there's our two Thunderbolt ports and the two mini display port in to route video through Thunderbolt, if that's your choice. Now back over to ASRock, as we found the information on the WRX80 Creator, we need to go over to support. And this is some wonderful information. We're going to go to the manual in a minute, but first thing we need to look at is let's check the BIOS. And there's nothing listed for the BIOS. There will be eventually. So let's go to the CPU support list. And voila, this shows the WRX80. See if I can zoom in on that just a tad bit. Okay, that helps on the CPU support list. If you'll notice here, we've got a 3945, 55, and a 75, and a 3995. So we have 4 of the 3000 series, and they only have 3 right now listed for the 5000 series, the 65, the 75, and the 95. I expect there will be another one or 2 eventually listed, but this is what they had access to. Anyway, the point of it is, over here on the far right, bootable since BIOS, all. Doesn't say what version of the BIOS, it just says bootable, all. Validated, all. Shows the cache, the frequency, the core, power is the same on all of them. So that is a pretty nice list and the best list. And if we were to go update the BIOS, click here, it just takes us to an empty page. There's nothing there yet. The other list that's most fascinating is the memory QVL, because we're looking at the Chagall for the 5900 series, and there's 2 different memory lists. And if we look at these lists, according to, let's say, speed, this goes up to 4400 and shows an 8 gig. This is what I wanted to point out. If you can live with 4000, you can get up to a 16 gig stick. And I think that needs to be pointed out, because if you want the density, you can get the DDR4 3200, even though no one's tested it. Kingston has it, and there's another vendor that has it that I have seen that'll get you ECC DDR4 3200. But if you want to overclock, you're going to need to probably stick with this list, because I expect there's going to be some more testing going on where they're going to do some tweakings with the BIOS, and they will eventually tell us the other RAM that they've worked with. Now, I expect other RAM will work, and I'd like to try it. But if it's not on the QVL, it's going to be hit and miss. So look at the density of the chips, see how far you want to go, and then choose whether you want faster RAM or quantity of RAM. As we deal with the spec that I outlined earlier for the Adobe After Effects multi-frame rendering CPU optimization formula, it deals with quantity, CPU cores, amount of RAM, CPU cores, and the amount of video RAM. None of that deals with speed. It's all about the spec of the quantity. Something to think about. And as good as the ASUS list was, I really like the way they've got this set up. So now let's go ahead and go to the manual. We have a user's manual, a quick installation guide, a RAID guide. I don't care for their RAID guide. The generic RAID guide available from AMD is my preference. So when you get ready to install the latest chipset, you'll just go do a search for AMD WRX80 chipset, and when you download that driver for the chipset on that motherboard, then you can also download the manual, the PDF manual about AMD RAID. It's the best, very complete, and it'll give you everything you need. Show you the directories, how all that's arranged that we've talked about before. So we're going to take a look at the user manual. The first thing I want to find is contents. If I go back to the home page, the index of this, and I click down here and I go to page 6, that works. However, some of the other pages will not take me to the page I want to go to. And this is one beef I have with the manual. So for example, if I'm going to go to specifications, if the links are working, I can click on specifications, then I'll get there. I have one computer set up where I have hyperlinks turned off like that for a reason I'm not going to get into another video. But I mention it because relying on the page numbers may not get you the page you think you're going to. So you may have to do a search for the word. So the things we look for. Number one, once we get to contents, we want to find a block wiring diagram. We may or may not have it. Depends. The other thing we want to look for from the contents are the specifications. We're going to look at that. Another thing we want to look at are how the slots are laid out, because the assignment of the PCI Express slots is kind of weird. It's opposite of what I'm used to. It's important how that works even for the first GPU. We'll look at that. And also, another resource we want to look at that we manage is the M.2 slots. We know there's 2 slots. One's to the CPU and one is to the chipset. So I want to see how that's managed. And then anything else we might look at on lower end boards would be anything with shared resources, which would reference the U.2 connector. It may be a shared resources. Some motherboards have that shared, some don't. It depends. But I want to double check. And I think it's important to point those things out. So from contents, we have specifications to reiterate, motherboard layout. We've looked at I/O panel. We'll look at it again. This is the one we need to spend some time on. This says ASRock Thunderbolt 4 module. That's wicked. DIMMs we'll look at because the layout is important. Also the expansion slots. Jumpers need to be aware of and know about. Onboard headers and connectors we need to know about. And of course your package contents. This is something we need to go over when we get the board, when we do an unboxing. We need to make sure everything is there. There's no deal killers. To reiterate, the motherboard, a quick install guide, not a big deal. The support CD is a big deal, but it wouldn't stop us from building. The serial cable is not a big deal, but would slow things down, but not stop us. The Wi-Fi antennas, again, if you need these things, they're not in the box. You've got to address that before you build, because to reiterate, the manufacturer is going to say, send it back. They won't send you the parts. It doesn't work that way. Be nice if it did. That way you could get it up and be working with it, but you know, downtime, it is what it is. So be sure when you do your unboxing to inventory your parts. These things I'm pointing out are things that we've had with other viewers. They ask, what do I do? So instead of telling you after the fact, we want to tell you before the fact. Specifications. We're an EATX motherboard, which is nice. We have support for the Ryzen Pro, to reiterate, 5000 and 3000 series processors. And this motherboard ships with support for both right now. And we have to keep in mind, this motherboard is available on Newegg right now. Now, I've checked Amazon, not available. I've also seen at least three vendors in the UK. There may be a couple more. I'm not sure, haven't verified. But there will be more in time. My expectation, Amazon is probably going to be another maybe 3 to 6 months out before they have it. And the reason I say that is because the second motherboard from Gigabyte, which is in their rack configurations, but it's just a motherboard, is still not available on Amazon, but it is available from Newegg and has been now for probably about 3 months. So Amazon will eventually get it, they just don't have it yet. And they don't have this board, but eventually they will. I want to point that out. And when they do, we'll get a link up. And of course, the biggie on this is 8-channel. So for those of you that have had dual channel, 8-channel is a big deal. And for those of you that have had 4-channel, 8-channel is still a big deal. And we get support for ECC and non-ECC RAM. We've talked about the speeds. I've given you my take on that. Even though this will support 2 terabytes and the RAM is available, to buy that RAM, which would be ECC, to get 2 terabytes, would be like buying a car. So to reiterate that, it's easy to get to 512 gigs RAM. I think based on the formula, most will probably opt for 256 gigs of RAM, but we would like to take it to 512 because it's a realistic number. But it will be with ECC because, again, this is a workstation. It's significant how far we've moved in such a short amount of time. And we're still taking a lot of this for granted. The expansion slots, the chipset, a vertical M.2 slot for the Wi-Fi, supports NVMe as a boot disk, and another expansion slot that is not pointed out that we're going to get to is how they've got Thunderbolt on here. Talks about the Thunderbolt controller. This is the Intel JHL 8540 Thunderbolt 4, which would be the Maple Ridge, 2 ports, and it will support a maximum resolution of 4K by 2K, so 4096 by 2160 at 60 Hertz for dual display over a single cable. Wicked. Discrete card is required for Thunderbolt. Yep. And the A-Speed BMC controller, and that'll support 1920 by 1200. And the audio codec, which is Realtek. Blu-ray support, surge protection, even mentions the headphone amp they use. And of course the Nahimic audio. Shows the two 10 gigabit LAN ports, but this does not give the indication of the chip. We'll find that out. This may be a Quantia. I don't remember. We look at a lot of motherboards when you guys ask questions, so it's hard to keep all that between my ears. Hopefully Wi-Fi with this module will not be a problem, and when I say that, because of the history we had with the TRX40 Designaire, at the time Windows was not able to ascertain the chipset on the Wi-Fi, so some of the information out there was all wrong about what to do, things to turn off. It was squirrely. And what we had to do was we had to slipstream the driver into Windows. What would happen is you'd go to install Windows, you'd get a BSOD during install. It's because Windows, to reiterate, couldn't correctly identify that chip. So I point this out now that if anybody has a problem with that, I don't think you will. I think Windows has gotten over it for Windows 10 and for Windows 11. But if it ever comes up, the Wi-Fi module is the problem. If you can't physically pull it out, you're going to have to slipstream the driver in there so that as it does the install, it'll get on past it. We had that with this machine. PITA. We like to keep things simple and make it work. And we would definitely suggest Windows 10 with this build. If you want to do Windows 11, I think Windows 11 still has a few little bugs to work out. Be my guest. Let's take a look at the I/O panel. We're just trying to hit the high points. Not everything, just some features that we need to point out. Right here, 13 and 12, these 2 Thunderbolt ports and 2 mini display ports. Let's go take a look now at the ASRock Thunderbolt 4 module. And this is not like anything I've ever seen. Now remember, this is sitting in the middle of the panel. And this gives us a configuration of the ASRock Thunderbolt 4 module, which gives us 2 USB-C ports on the left, and then on the right, in this 3-dimensional drawing, the 2 mini display ports. And if you'll notice the connector down there, the name on that is TBT_M2_1 and TBT_M2_2. There's a slot on this side for this card and a slot on this side for this card. And those slots are for Thunderbolt. So Thunderbolt is not built onto the motherboard. Thunderbolt is not an add-in card. Thunderbolt is sitting in this. It's an add-in card, but it's built onto the motherboard, but it's plugged in because it's in the middle of I/O panel. It's the craziest thing I've ever seen. But to reiterate, there's no separate cable to plug in to get the functionality with the BIOS. So whatever is going on with that cable to plug in to get access to the BIOS for full functionality, everything is done through the connector. This is the smartest of anything I've seen anybody do. Everything else looks squirrely now compared to this. I'm eager to see how well this lays out because I'm a preference of a fan, and it's only based on experience of having Thunderbolt, whether it built onto the motherboard or Thunderbolt as an add-in card, because if Thunderbolt's built onto the motherboard, when you update the BIOS, that's how you update the firmware on Thunderbolt. So if I have a separate add-in card, I can update the firmware on Thunderbolt separate from the BIOS. I'm not dependent. I'm still tied to the BIOS, but I'm not as dependent upon the BIOS because there are some situations and occasions where firmware has to have been updated to, without getting into the weeds, to things that you might not normally think or expect to do that can only be done with a separate add-in card. So with this setup, it's going to be treated as a motherboard device, which means motherboard BIOS updates to update the firmware on Thunderbolt. So we're going to have to really keep an eye on that to keep functionality. And there's not going to be any kind of swapping out a module. If that module doesn't work, that means that motherboard's got to be swapped out. There's no way that I'm aware of, and I don't know if there will be in the future to get access to that. It kind of reminds me of the MSI motherboard that has the MSI quad card. You can't buy it separately unless somebody has sold it out of a package. You can't buy that card by itself from a source vendor from the manufacturer. The only way to get that card, to reiterate, for 4 M.2 drives was if somebody pulled it out of the package and didn't want to use it and didn't understand how to use it. That's kind of where this is at, because that's not a straight PCI Express card. It plugs into a special M.2 connector. And normally an M.2 connector, if it's for PCI Express, would be 4 lanes. However, the Wi-Fi card is using 1 lane. So it's almost as if this card has 4 lanes on one side because it's PCI Express 3, and the other slot that would normally be 4 lanes apparently is how they're doing the pinout, which could be the 14-1 pin. I don't know. It could be, as other boards that ASRock has had a 5-pin header. So somehow they're doing that, and I wish I knew the pinout. But all that matters is that it works and it's different. And this just reinforces Thunderbolt 4, for everyone that we've looked at, is vendor specific. And you can't get any more specific and different than this. And who knows if they'll keep this or if this is a one-time deal. Who knows? We don't. But this is what we're dealing with. And right here it says, proprietary design for ASRock specific motherboard. Please note that plugging into other M.2 connector may damage the motherboard and this module. So don't. And if you're plugging in USB-C on those ports, you'll get 10 gigabit. But if you plug in Thunderbolt 3, 30 gigabit, Thunderbolt 4, 40 gigabit, bidirectional. Daisy chain up to 3 Thunderbolt devices, supports power delivery, and there's no mention of plugging in a separate power cable, and I don't see a separate cable that plugs into that module. So whatever they're doing and everything they're doing is through those 2 connectors. Fascinating. So one other thing we can do, we looked at specifications, motherboard layout, I/O panel, and the ASRock Thunderbolt 4. I'd like to take a look at the memory modules, and I want to take a look at the expansion slots. Now, for those that ask how the memory works, set it up according to this. If you've got 1 DIMM, you're looking at C1, and C1 is this second slot. If you're going to go with 2, then you're looking at D1. And if you're looking at 4, then you got A1 and B1. So we start, to reiterate, with C1. That's the first slot. The second slot would be D1. Now, the reason I'm pointing this out, and I don't remember how the other WRX80 motherboards are set, but looking at this compared to the TRX40, where we had to go 1 slot on each side of the CPU, to reiterate with this, we stay 4 slots on one side of the CPU before we go to the other 4 slots. If we're using all 8 slots, then we're using all 8 slots. But if you're going to go with half, you see how that works. Follow the manual. Whatever it says, follow the manual. Now, going back to contents, we need to take a look at the expansion slots. And this is the best definition we've got on the expansion slots. And these are numbered 1 through 7. Number 4 and number 6 are 8-lane slots. And if we're using a single graphics card, they say to go to PCI Express by 16_2, which is kind of curious because I would have said go to the first slot. So you want to make note of that. 1 card, 2 cards, 3 cards, and 4. Looking at the motherboard layout, which is usually the first or second thing I go to, we see a layout for the RAM, the 4 primary slots on top, the secondary slots on the bottom, and PCI Express by 16_1 from the top down. Other motherboards had them from the bottom up. So this is more in line with what we're used to. However, for the first GPU, we were told specifically to use PCI Express number 2. Okay, we see an M.2_1 and M.2_2 here on the right, primary to the CPU, secondary to the chipset. I've made my peace with the way the slots are allocated. It is what it is. I can live with it. So I want to go through some details real quick. MSI's got a motherboard coming out. No details yet. Dell's going to be doing something with a new reworked workstation. Excited about that. But the most exciting thing that I wanted to cover in this was about the ASRock motherboard, that we're going to have an ASRock WRX80 Creator that has Thunderbolt 4 on it. And I think that's significant for those that need it and want it. I'm one of those. I'm a fan of that because of the 3 things Thunderbolt can do, I'm a big fan of 1. And I want to have connectivity to whatever data a client presents to me with a project, whether it's through Thunderbolt or whether it's through 10 gigabit Ethernet. I want to be prepared. So I hope you enjoyed this. I want to thank you for watching. My name's Gil Boyd. This is BuildOrBuy. We'll look forward to seeing you next video. We're out.